In the frozen north, they say mercy is just a slow suicide. We are taught that the heat of the pack is reserved for those who hunt, while those who can't carry the flame are left to freeze in the shadows. For years, that shadow was my only home. As an Omega of the Winter bloodline, I was the palace footstool, scrubbing the frost from the courtyard at midnight while the Alpha's daughter, Geneva, poured buckets of ice water over my head just to hear me shiver. "Stay cold, Omega," she'd laugh. "It's all your blood is good for." They called me a broken vessel, a fireless mistake, and when they discovered I was carrying a rogue's child, they decided to sell me like common livestock to the most feared monster in the Lycan Empire. But they forgot one thing: the coldest winter always begins with a single, silent flake. They sold me to a monster, but they didn't realize that by doing so, they were giving that monster the only thing he ever truly feared: a reason to burn their world down to protect me. Crafting a world this immersive, from the intricate script to the unique visual designs, takes our team weeks of sleepless nights. If you believe no one should ever be traded like currency, please consider subscribing. It's a small way to support the stories of the silenced and ensure their justice is finally heard. The transition from the frost-bitten stage of the auction to the interior of the Lycan carriage felt like passing through a portal into another world. Evangeline huddled against the velvet seat, her hands protectively cupped over the slight swell of her stomach. She expected the journey to end at a chopping block or a breeding kennel. She expected the Monster King to look at her with the same transactional hunger as Alpha Kieran. Instead, Thaddeus Stormborn sat in the shadows of the carriage, his silver eyes fixed on the window, radiating a silence that was heavy, but strangely lacked the stinging malice of Frosthollow. When the carriage finally slowed, the Obsidian Palace rose out of the volcanic mist like a jagged crown. Evangeline trembled as the doors were opened by a tall, composed male with hair the color of cooling embers. "Welcome, my lady," the male said, bowing deeply. "I am Cashin Emberstone, High Chancellor and witness to the Stormborn line. The king has requested I escort you to your sanctuary." Evangeline flinched at the word. Sanctuary usually meant a locked room in her experience. But as Cashin led her through the towering halls, she didn't see iron bars. She saw walls made of polished volcanic glass that shimmered with internal heat. They reached a set of double doors carved from ancient cedar. When they swung open, Evangeline froze. The suite was a masterpiece of luxury. A massive bed draped in midnight silk sat before a hearth of roaring blue flames. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a valley of bioluminescent flora. This wasn't a dungeon, it was a cage of gold. "Why?" Evangeline whispered, her voice cracking. "I am a slave. A winterblood. Why put me here?" Cashin's expression was unreadable, yet gentle. "The king does not keep slaves, Evangeline. He keeps what is his. And you're his mate. That changes everything." The silence was shattered by the heavy tread of boots. Thaddeus entered the room, his presence so dominant it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. He dismissed Cashin with a sharp nod and turned his gaze toward Evangeline. He stalked forward until he was inches away, his scent, storm clouds and ozone, overwhelming her senses. "Kieran told me you were defective," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice a low vibration in her chest. "He said you were a hollow vessel. But I smell 2 heartbeats, Evangeline. And neither of them belongs to a weakling." Evangeline's breath hitched. She went to her knees, bowing her head. I was with a rogue, Your Majesty. I showed mercy, and he took." "I don't care how it happened," Thaddeus interrupted, gripping her chin and forcing her to meet his silver eyes. She expected rage, a strike, or a decree of exile. Instead, he looked at her abdomen with a fierce, possessive intensity. "You carry a child. A life forged in winter. In this palace, that makes you sacred. I have already summoned the royal healers. They will ensure you and the heir want for nothing." He left as quickly as he arrived, leaving Evangeline in a state of stunned vertigo. Hours later, under Cashin's quiet supervision, she was led to a sunken bath of steaming mineral water. For the first time in 19 years, she stripped away the soot-stained rags of a servant. As she lowered herself into the water, the heat began to draw something out from beneath her skin. The steam seemed to cling to her back, swirling in patterns that defied the draft of the room. Evangeline caught her reflection in the glass wall and gasped. Traced in shimmering silver across her shoulder blades were the faint, glowing outlines of wings, delicate, crystalline, and unmistakably royal. "The Frost Phoenix," Cashin whispered from the doorway, his eyes wide with ancestral shock. The legend was true. The Winter Rose line wasn't weak, it was just waiting. But the wonder of the moment was quickly eclipsed by a darker truth. Cashin stepped forward, holding a small vial of clear liquid, the vitamins Luna Lilith had forced Evangeline to swallow every morning since her first cycle. "I had the royal chemists analyze the remnants of the medicine you brought from Frosthollow," Cashin said, his voice turning ice cold. "This isn't a supplement, Evangeline. This is concentrated Wolf-Bane, refined to a microdosage. It was designed to keep your wolf in a state of permanent paralysis, to suppress your scent, to make sure you never shifted." The water in the bath began to hiss. Evangeline's blood ran cold as the realization shattered her soul. She hadn't been born a hollow-blood. She had been made one. Her own Alpha had sold her, but her Luna, the woman who was supposed to protect the pack's females, had been systematically poisoning her for years to ensure she stayed a servant, never knowing the goddess-tier power that lived in her veins. "They didn't hate me because I was weak," Evangeline breathed, the water around her fingers beginning to crystallize into jagged shards of ice. "They hated me because they were terrified of what I was." The betrayal felt like a second pregnancy, a heavy, cold weight of vengeance growing inside her. What is the worst kind of betrayal? Being sold like livestock by your Alpha for a profit, or being slowly poisoned by your Luna for years just to keep you under her thumb? Vote Alpha or Luna in the comments below. The steam in the bathhouse had turned to a fine frost, coating the volcanic glass in a veil of white. Evangeline stepped out of the water, her skin humming with a strange, tectonic energy. The Wolf-Bane was out of her system, and for the first time in her life, the silence in her mind was gone. It was replaced by a low, melodic thrum, a heartbeat that wasn't hers, yet lived within her. "Evangeline." Thaddeus stood by the arched window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the moonlit peaks. He held a weathered leather pouch, the kind rogues used to carry their few earthly possessions. He placed it on the stone table between them. Inside was a tarnished silver signet ring, engraved with a storm-tossed oak. Evangeline's breath caught. She knew that ring. She had seen it hanging on a cord around the neck of the rogue she had hidden in the hayloft a year ago, the man who had given her a night of tenderness before vanishing into the blizzard. "You said you showed mercy to a rogue," Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "That rogue was my brother, Alaric Stormborn. He was the Crown Prince of the Lycan Empire before he was framed for treason and driven into the wastes. He spent his final months looking for a way to stop the rot in the north. He found you instead." The world tilted. The rogue's bastard she carried was a royal scion. Her child wasn't a mistake of the shadows, it was the union of the two most powerful bloodlines in the frozen territories. "Alaric is gone," Thaddeus continued, his hand tightening on the windowsill. "But he left behind the only thing that can stabilize this empire. You. And the heir." As the truth settled into her bones, the thrum in her mind reached a crescendo. "Child of the ash, queen of the rime." The voice was ancient, sounding like ice cracking on a deep lake. It was her wolf, the Frost Phoenix. For years, the bird wolf had been caged by Lilith's poison, but now it stretched its wings within Evangeline's spirit. The shimmering markings on her back flared with the brilliant, cold light, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Thaddeus didn't flinch. He walked toward her, his expression grimmer than before. "We don't have time for a slow awakening, Evangeline." Kieran Frosthollow didn't sell you just for gold. He is in league with Valen Darkmaw. They're gathering an army of fireshifters to melt the northern borders. They want a great war that will turn the Lycan Empire into a graveyard, and they need you dead because a frost phoenix is the only thing that can extinguish their flame. He led her to the training balcony, a wide expanse of obsidian overlooking the frozen tundra. If you cannot control the power, it will consume you and the child. You must learn to ground the winter. The training was brutal. Thaddeus pushed her to the edge of exhaustion, forcing her to reach into the void where her fire should have been and find the absolute zero beneath. At first, she could only produce a light dusting of snow. But as she thought of Geneva's laughter and Lilith's vial of poison, the grief turned into a sharp, crystalline focus. Focus on the blood, Thaddeus commanded, his own power radiating in waves of oppressive heat to test her. Freeze the moisture in the air. Turn the vapor into a blade. Evangeline closed her eyes. She felt the child within her surge, its tiny heartbeat syncing with the frost phoenix's cry. She reached out her hand, and with a sudden, violent snap of energy, a 50-foot arc of the balcony froze solid. The air groaned as the flash freeze expanded, turning the stone into a jagged sculpture of ice. Her eyes snapped open, now a piercing, translucent blue that held no trace of the Omega mage she used to be. Again, Thaddeus said, a rare flash of pride crossing his features. You are no longer a footstool, Evangeline. You are the storm. Now that Evangeline has awakened as a royal frost phoenix, carrying the true Stormborn heir, how do you think Geneva will react when she realizes the girl she treated like garbage is now the only wolf powerful enough to decide her fate? The obsidian gates of the Lycan Palace groaned as they admitted a carriage bearing the crest of the Frosthollow pack. Alpha Kieran and Luna Lilith stepped onto the volcanic stone with the arrogance of merchants coming to collect an overdue debt. They were led into the great hall, where the air was unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the geothermal vents of the palace. At the far end, seated on a throne of jagged ice, was a woman draped in silver fox furs. Evangeline. Lilith's voice was a shrill spike of laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. She didn't bow. She didn't even slow her pace. Look at you, playing dress-up in the monster's house. I hope you haven't forgotten how to scrub a floor, because we've come to renegotiate your price. Kieran needs more gold for the border defenses, and we've decided a mate of the Lycan King is worth double what he paid. Kieran stepped forward, his eyes roaming the hall with greed. Stand up, girl. Your alpha is speaking. We have business with Thaddeus, and you're going to convince him that. You are not in Frosthollow anymore, Kieran. Evangeline's voice was low, vibrating with the resonance of a tectonic plate shifting. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at them with eyes that had turned into chips of blue diamond. Thaddeus stepped out from the shadows of the throne, his hand resting on the hilt of a blackened steel blade. This is trial one, he rumbled, his silver eyes fixed on the visitors. The trial of justice. Evangeline, the floor is yours. You sold me like livestock, Evangeline said, her gaze drifting to Lilith. You poisoned my wolf for 19 years to keep me small enough to fit under your boot. You traded the lives of your pack for luxury. She raised her hand, and the air in the room crystallized. I will not execute you. Death is too quick for those who profit from suffering. Instead, by the power of the Stormborn line, I strip you of your title. The Frosthollow lands are hereby annexed. You will return to the north not as rulers, but as the very Omegas you despised, serving the refugees you displaced. Kieran's face went purple with rage. You can't do this. We are protected by... The doors to the hall burst open, but it wasn't the royal guard. A dozen figures draped in crimson robes surged inward, their hands glowing with a violent, orange heat. Valen Darkmaw's fireshifters had infiltrated the palace. In the chaos, smoke began to fill the room, and the scent of burning cedar replaced the ozone. The nursery. Evangeline screamed. The attackers hadn't come for the throne, They had come for the heir. She ignored Kieran and Lilith, sprinting toward the residential wing. She found the nursery engulfed in an unnatural, magical fire that devoured the oxygen. 3 shifters stood in the center, their flames licking the ceiling, turning the room into a furnace. Evangeline felt the child within her surge, a desperate, freezing pulse of survival. The heat was enough to melt lead, but Evangeline didn't retreat. She reached deep into her spirit, shattering the last of the internal walls Lilith's poison had built. With a sound like a glacier cracking, she shifted. It wasn't the bloody, bone-breaking transformation of a common wolf. Her body exploded into a flurry of crystalline feathers and silver-blue fur. In the center of the burning room stood a creature of myth, a massive wolf with the broad, luminous wings of a phoenix. The shifters recoiled, their flames sputtering. Evangeline threw her head back and unleashed the Glacial Howl. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical wave of absolute zero. The orange flames didn't just go out, they froze in midair. The fire shifters were encased in pillars of translucent blue ice, their expressions of terror preserved like prehistoric insects in amber. The nursery was silent, the heat replaced by a pristine, crystalline peace. Thaddeus burst into the room, stopping short as he looked at the goddess wolf standing over the uncharred cradle. He looked at the ice sculptures of his enemies and then at his mate. For the first time in his life, the king of the Lycans bowed his head in true, unprompted submission. Outside, in the hall, Lilith was being dragged away in chains, her eyes wide with the realization that the hollow blood was now the sovereign of the frost. Did you enjoy seeing Lilith and Kieran forced to face the woman they once used as a footstool? On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfying was it to see that Glacial Howl turn the tables? The horizon of the Lycan Empire was no longer a silhouette of volcanic peaks, it was a wall of fire. Valan Darkmaw's coalition of fire shifters had descended like a scorched earth plague, turning the Obsidian valleys into rivers of molten glass. This was Trial 3, the trial of the Sovereign. Thaddeus stood at the vanguard of the Lycan lines, his heavy black armor glowing dull red from the heat. He was a god of war, but even gods bleed. A silver-tipped spear, enchanted with the searing embers of the Darkmaw, tore through his shoulder. He fell to one knee, the scorched ground hissing against his blood. Valan Darkmaw stepped through the smoke, his eyes twin furnaces of greed. The Stormborn line ends in ash, Valan roared, raising a blade forged in the heart of a volcano. But the air didn't catch fire. It died. A silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight swept across the battlefield. The screaming shifters and clashing steel went mute as the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single heartbeat. From the ridge of the Obsidian Palace, a figure descended. Evangeline did not run, she walked. With every step, the molten glass beneath her feet froze into sapphire-colored stone. She was no longer wearing the fox furs of a mate. She was draped in the aurora, her skin glowing with a terrifying, celestial light. You came for a kingdom, Evangeline's voice vibrated through the marrow of every wolf on the field. But you forgot that I am the one who owns the winter. She raised both hands, her frost phoenix markings flaring through the back of her gown with blinding brilliance. She didn't call for a blizzard. She reached for the very life force of the enemy. In a single, sweeping motion, she unleashed a pulse of absolute zero. It didn't strike the armor or the shields, it struck the veins. Thaddeus watched in awe as 1,000 fire shifters were silenced. They didn't fall, they became statues, their blood turning to ice in their tracks. Only Valan was spared, left trembling and shivering in a world that had gone white and silent. Thaddeus stood, his wound knitting together as the cool air soothed the magical burn. He looked at Evangeline, the woman he had bought for silver, and realized he was standing in the presence of the North's true architect. The resolution was as cold as the victory. Kieran Frosthollow and his daughter, Geneva, were brought to the edge of the frozen battlefield. They looked at the statues of their allies and then at the woman they had once called fireless. You traded me for gold, Evangeline said, her voice devoid of hate, only the cold clarity of a queen. So, you shall live in the world you built. Kieran, you are exiled to the dead tundra, to wander the ice without a pack, without a fire, and without a name. Geneva, you once loved to watch me scrub. You will spend the next 20 years serving in the orphanages of the refugees your father tried to burn. You will learn the value of the lives you thought were disposable. That night, beneath the sky dancing with silver blue lights, Thaddeus and Evangeline stood on the highest tower of the palace. He knelt before her, not as a king to a mate, but as a subject to a sovereign. They completed the bond as the first true snow of the new era began to fall. It wasn't the stinging, bitter ice of the past, it was a soft, protective blanket for the kingdom. 3 months later, the legacy was sealed. The palace was filled with the scent of pine and new life. In a cradle carved from living ice, the heir was born a wolf pup with silver blue fur and eyes that held the spark of 1,000 winters. I was born in the shadows of those who thought they were sons. I was sold as a slave to a man they called a monster. They called me Hollowblood because they couldn't see the blizzard I was holding back. But the winter doesn't care what you call it. It only cares that when it arrives, everything else must bow. I am Evangeline Stormborn, the Ice Queen of the North. The Omega is dead. Long live the Queen. Thank you for witnessing Evangeline's journey from a sold servant to a sovereign goddess. If this story of frozen vengeance and royal rebirth captured your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Every journey we share is a tribute to those who refuse to stay broken. Would you like to see the next chapter, where the silver blue heir discovers their power? Let us know in the comments below.